everybody, let's talk about compare contrast. So the idea with compare contrast is to analyze how things are alike and how they are different. The reason that we write this type of paper is to show that we understand the differences between, or we understand the idea of similarities and differences. Sometimes we also talk about this in terms of advantages and disadvantages. So being able to understand how to put things together because they are alike, because they are different, because one thing is a better choice over the other when we consider the good and the bad of two different choices. So all of those are reasons that we might look at compare contrast. So here's some things you need to keep in mind when you're writing compare contrast. First of all, your topics or your two subjects that you're going to compare and contrast, they need to be related somehow. So we want to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges, because not only do you have to tell us how they're different, you also have to tell us how they are alike. So for this paper, you're going to cover both, compare and contrast. So don't forget the compare part, telling us how they are similar. And then you also need a so what for this paper. So just because they are alike or different is not a so what. Why do we care that they are alike and different? That is the so what of your paper. So what are you trying to teach us because these things are alike and different? You'll also have to consider your audience. You're writing to a college audience, an educated audience, and so you need to consider that when you're choosing your topics. Please don't write about the differences between cats and dogs. We already know that. Don't insult your reader's intelligence and write about things that they already know that are very common knowledge. So you want to choose topics that may not be familiar to your audience, but would be intriguing to them. So you need to make sure that you consider your audience, what they would be interested in learning about. And a lot of that is because you have some kind of insight into a topic that other people don't. So the two subjects that you choose to compare and contrast need to teach us something. So keep that in mind. Also consider then in the points that you present in the body. Again, don't tell us what we already know. So even if it's a topic we're familiar with, maybe you have something to teach us about that topic that we may not know about. And that's fine, but make sure that you're speaking to an educated audience and you're trying to teach us something we may not know. So topic and details that you include, those need to be appropriate for the audience that you are writing to. Okay. The thesis for this particular paper needs to name both of the subjects that you're going to be writing about. Also that you're looking at compare and contrast of them. And what are we supposed to learn? So we need two topics that we're comparing, contrasting those two topics, and the so what of those. You do not need to provide us with your main ideas then that you're going to include. That's not necessary for this thesis because you just want it to be one sentence. So keep it short. Tell us what we need to know. Okay. So a couple things. Topic needs to be higher order thinking. So something that applies to our lives, but it's interesting and new information. Okay. You present your similarities and differences in a way that we understand the relationships between them. Transitions are very, very important to this paper. The reason is you're going to be moving back and forth and back and forth. So you have to have really good transitions that are very clear so that we see that movement back and forth. Also, you need to have a very clear so what, and then the details that you include about your two topics or about your two subjects then need to relate to that so what. So make sure that you have a clear so what and that the body of the paper drives home what you're trying to teach us about these two particular subjects. Okay. And then the specific details that you include, maybe the examples you give, need to be appropriate for a college educated audience. Okay, so think about that when you're brainstorming, when you're choosing your topic. Okay. There are two ways you can organize this paper. Of course, brainstorming. This is the typical way we brainstorm for compare contrast, is that we use the Venn diagram. So maybe over here, I talk about one of my subjects, and then over here I talk about the other subject. One thing you want to keep in mind is that this paper requires balance. So if I talk about cost over on this side under subject number 1, I also need to talk about cost over on this side. So I can't make 3 main points about one topic and then make 3 completely unrelated points about my other topic. You have to feel a balance between the two. Whatever you talk about for one subject, you also have to bring up that same topic for the other subject. So when you're doing this, make sure that there's nice balance between your two subjects. So when you're planning this out in your Venn diagram, make sure that whatever you talk about over on this side, you also talk about over on that side. Okay. Not that they'll be the same. The cost of one may be very different than the cost of the other. And so in that, we see those differences. But we have to make sure that we're at least talking in the same arenas. Otherwise, you basically have 2 separate papers put together. Okay, so we don't want to do that. So we need to see those relationships. It needs to be balanced. All right, 2 ways to organize it. And you can see it down here. You can either do it by subject. So tell me all of subject 1. And then give me the 3 points you're going to say about it. And then give me all of subject 2 and 3 similar points you're going to say about that. And then how together they are also similar. So it could look like that. Maybe, I choose the difference between English 101 and 102. Now, that's not a really deep, interesting topic. So it's not a great example, but it's an example. So maybe I tell you all about English 101. And so I tell you maybe, how many papers you have to write in English 101. I talk about the grammar and vocab in English 101, and then maybe I talk about research. Okay. Well, then in English 102, which is my other subject, I would talk about very similar things. The papers you have to write, vocab and grammar, and research. Okay. And then I would tell you how they are similar. All right. So that's one way to do it, subject by subject. If you are doing 2 subjects that are it's really important that you really talk all about one subject and then talk all about the other subject, because you don't want your reader to get lost. Maybe it's very technical or something like that. Then this might be the type that you want to consider. The other one is point by point. And so it's basically the flip-flop of subject by subject. So over here, what I'm doing is maybe I talk about the types of papers you have to write, and then I tell you about English 101 versus English 102. Okay, then I go down to the next one. I talk about vocab and grammar, and I tell you about English 101 and English 102. Okay, and then point number 3 was research, and I talk about English 101 and then English 102. And then I probably might still need another paragraph that then talks about how they are the same. All right. So you can see basically these are just opposites of each other. One goes by the subjects, and one goes by the points you're going to make about those subjects. Either one is fine, but you have to have a clear organizational plan for this paper, or it becomes a jumbled mess very quickly. All right. Also over here on this one, if I talk about types of papers you have to write, and I talk about English 101 as my first one, I need to use English 101 as my first subject in all of them. You don't want your reader to be confused. So this is not a chance to just mix things up as you go along. It needs to be very, very similar and balanced. So over here, under English 101, if my first point was going to be the papers that I need to write, that's then also going to be point 1 under English 102. Okay, so you don't want to jumble all these up versus these. It's very confusing to your reader. They need to understand clear organization for this paper, or they will get lost. Okay, so keep that in mind, that you really have to focus on organization. The last thing that I wanted to talk to you about is, as far as the grammar for this paper, one of the big things that you have to make sure you avoid is the use of the word it. Because you're talking about 2 subjects in this paper, Using the word it becomes very unclear. We have no idea what it is specifically, and your reader will be lost. So not a word you want to use in this paper. Just to keep the clarity. There's always better words, of course, but for this paper especially, it can be very, very confusing. So make sure you're giving me how they are alike and how they are different. For the introduction and conclusion of this paper, you might want to explain what your relationship, for the introduction, you might want to explain what your relationship is to the topic, how you were educated on this topic, why it matters. And then in the conclusion, you can talk about maybe where you see this topic in the future, or why it matters, how has it affected your life or our lives, because they are alike and different. So it's a way to really drive home your so what in the conclusion. So just some ideas for the introduction and conclusion. But in the body, make sure you have clear transitions, very clear, specific words, so we know which of the two subjects you're talking about, and we see relationships. So this paper is all about understanding relationships between those ideas. So make sure that's very clear. Other than that, you want to make sure you pick good subjects that are appropriate to your audience. Otherwise, happy writing, and let me know if you have any questions.